One of my favorite colleagues used to say, if somebody asked you who you are, how do you answer? And one of the things he was interested in is whether you would first say, I'm a woman or I'm a doctor. In my case, it would be hard for me to say one without the other. I mean, I think I am definitely a woman doctor, and this has affected me. And I think instead of trying to suppress what is usually thought of womanly attributes, which is sensitivity and caring and so on, I have tried to capitalize on that, and incorporate those into the kind of physician I am. Years before I started my studies, there had been articles about uncooperative patients, but they always blamed the patient. The patient was stupid, was uneducated, didn't accept authority, or whatever it was, came from a different culture. And I began to realize it was neither the patient, nor the disease, nor the particular treatment, but that the roots of the problem lay in the doctor-patient relationship.
Barbara Korsch has never conformed. At 86, she refuses to allow age or brisk California temperatures to keep her from her morning swim. She believes her longevity and determination have a lot to do with her family.
In my family, there's a very long tradition of not accepting what's going on if it doesn't seem right, but challenging it. My great-grandmother challenged it, my mother challenged it, my father challenged the whole system, much to his detriment sometime, but none of them were ever afraid to say, it's not right, let's find out why.
Barbara Korsch is heading off to work at Los Angeles Children's Hospital, where she has been a professor and practicing physician for over 40 years. It was more than 60 years ago when she graduated from Johns Hopkins Medical School at age 23, finding herself different from her fellow graduates. Not only was she younger, most medical students were just entering school when Korsch graduated, but she was also an immigrant, having narrowly escaped Nazi Germany a decade earlier due to her father's politics.
My father always fought the establishment. For a very short time, he was even prime minister. He had his own political party. My family was very left-wing. It was a big part of our lives, was politics.
A professor of law, an author and activist, Korsch was blacklisted in Soviet Russia and considered an enemy by both capitalists and communists.
It wasn't until we left Germany because of the Nazis and emigrated. That's when my mother and I went together. My father went underground. He was one of the early people who anticipated Hitler. And of course, he was public enemy #1 when Hitler came. He was working with the concentration camps and with the rebellion and publishing a little newspaper, tiny. I saw it later, it was like Cops and Robbers. They would walk into the camps and the prisons have this in the bottom of their shoes and distribute. He was taking all kinds of wild chances, and it's a wonder that he ever got out alive. For years, we didn't know where he was. And he changed his appearance, he changed his name. I later saw his passport I would have never recognized. So that was, of course, our biggest anxiety those first years.
At 23, Barbara Korsch was already a survivor. And within a decade of graduating, she had already begun what would become a lifelong passion.
I had started asking the relevant questions when I was at New York Hospital, finding that patients weren't coming back after visits which had been technically perfect, beginning to ask the question, why don't they come? Why aren't they satisfied? And finding out that it was usually breakdowns in communication.
Her initial findings and their implications were met with harsh criticism from the medical establishment, but she persisted. Today, she is recognized as a pioneer in the field of doctor-patient communication. This is her story.
My father and I had lots of fun. He was a very big influence on my life. I was even closer to him than I was to my mother. He's responsible for much of my value system, my ethics, the fact that I'm a pacifist, the fact that I'm an atheist, the fact that I'm for the underdog and on the left of politics. And he always did some unconventional thing. When we were on vacation, he never stayed on the proper roads. He always knew a shortcut, and we always ended up in some farmer's yard and being thrown out, and he was very unconventional. And he and I used to go on blind journeys. We did that in Berlin, my father and I. And every once in a while, and this was typical of him too, you couldn't plan it. But one day we'd wake up, and it was a day for it. And we'd get a map of Berlin and take a pencil, and I'd close my eyes and I'd put it down somewhere on that map. And we would go there. And then we'd do whatever that area offered. It might be an elegant West End part of Berlin, and we'd go to a fancy restaurant, and I'd eat all kinds of things that were unsuitable for children, or we'd go to a theater, always unconventional things. But I have wonderful memories of that. So I decided at a ridiculous age to be a doctor, which was about 7. I wrote an essay in my class what I was going to be when I grew up, and I said I was going to be a doctor. I came from a family who were all great theoreticians, university professors, lots of discussion. Their main interest was politics and social action. And even as a little girl, it seemed to me they were talking about things all the time, but nothing was happening. So part of my motivation was, as much as I can remember, because this was early, was I wanted to do something. I didn't want something where you just talked. Well, it's ironic because the kind of medicine I've specialized in, you do a lot of talking. Does he have any complaints today?
No, he's looking very well today, actually. It's funny. So on the exam,
I want to hear what's funny.
Just that I walk in, I hear the kid has a complaint of high fever and sore throat, and he shakes my hand right away, and he doesn't look at all sick.
What is your plan?
Keep monitoring the fever and keep monitoring his PO intake, and have them call us back if he has another fever or other symptoms.
What about if he has a fever tomorrow again to 103, 104 in the morning?
I would like to see him back in clinic.
It's a long time since I've done any surgery or any doing like that. I mean, I do lay hands on patients, but actually it's much more listening, mostly listening, some talking. So, but my illusion, like every other person who goes into medicine, is you have these romantic notions, Marcus Belby and all the old heroes. In fact, I've been asked quite often how many lives I've saved, and I can't really say I've saved any. I think I've helped some people.
Hi, Ryan.
Hi.
This is Dr. Korsch.
Hi, how are you? Did you get a toy for him? No, we always like to.
I was remiss.
You were very amiss. Ryan is an interesting patient because the doctor didn't find anything on examination, right? Mm-hmm. What were you most concerned about when he said?
Well, I was concerned about the spiking fever. We've been on vacation. He'd done a lot of swimming in a public swimming pool on a cruise ship.
It's a tiny bit erythematous, you know. Do you know what you're going to be when you're a big guy?
A policeman.
Oh, we need those. We need good ones.
Yeah.
Masses or tenderness. Chris, anything else here that you wanted to look on?
No, his exam was otherwise entirely normal to my exam. No rashes, good pulses, good perfusion.
Can't find anything wrong with you.
Yeah, we're trying, dude.
Everything seems just fine.
Rash.
Just relax your leg.
He's to go up. Sometimes you do much better on the one you're not examining.
Yeah, they take it.
I won't profess to know exactly what motivates her internally. I suspect that her background, being an immigrant, has a lot to do with that. Having, I think, in her mother, an extraordinary role model, a very intelligent woman who is not to be denied in terms of her pursuit of education and knowledge. Growing up in a time when women in this country were second-class citizens, choosing a profession where there were very few women. And so she's been a maverick on so many fronts. It isn't surprising to me that she chose to be a proponent of communication at a time when people really dismissed it as sort of frivolous and soft and touchy-feely. So I think that's very consistent with her life and the challenges that she's faced. And while I don't think she chose that to continue along that trajectory, I think she was naturally drawn to it because she's had to make those sort of conquests throughout her life.
After Hitler came, both my mother and father lost their university jobs because those were state appointed, and so we had no income. And my father went underground, so my mother had to support us. So basically we ended up in this Swedish boarding school and spent 3 years there. And all that time we didn't know what had happened to my father. We had a good friend. His name was Bertolt Brecht, and he was a very famous German playwright. And he was a student of my father's. People came from all over the world to study with my father. So he had fled too, and had settled in Denmark in a farmhouse on an island in Denmark. And it was to him that my father escaped first and moved in with him. In the meantime, my sister had finished her psychology studies, and she was still in Berlin, and then there was a very dramatic episode when she went very sick. So my mother got terribly worried because my sister was there in Berlin alone and sick and all that. So she decided to chance it and go back to Germany to be with her sick child. Well, the first day my mother was there, some German friends of ours, the same ones who had notified her about my sister, made an arrangement to meet her in Midtown. So my mother decided to meet with her. So my sister was alone at home, and at that moment, the SS, the German, whatever they were called in English, I mean their Gestapo, came to the house and asked for my mother. And my sister said, "She's not here, she's in Sweden." And they said, "Oh no, that's not what we heard. We know she's with some Jewish friend and right in Berlin right now." And they decided they wanted to take my sister in the meantime as sort of a hostage. And she told them that she was very sick and that her doctor had said she couldn't get up and it might be life-threatening. And they called our nice Jewish pediatrician. He said, "Oh yes, I won't be responsible if you take this child. She's very sick." So they went to get more orders. And while they were gone, my sister wrote a message to my mother not to come back and wrapped the paper around a stone and threw it out of the window to our garden, hoping that somebody would find it. And actually, a neighbor did find it and then notify my mother. And my mother never came back to our house after that. And then the same friends who'd been involved in all that helped Sybil get ready to leave the country. They decided to take a midnight train to Holland and not let on that they knew one another. They were hoping very hard not to be identified. When my mother got on the train, she went to the opposite end of the train to sit by a different compartment, but there were no seats back there, and she stood, and as fate would have it, a very nice conductor came around and said, "Oh, we can't have you stand for all these hours. We'll find you a seat," and took her to the train back to the very compartment where my sister was sitting. So my mother had to sit in there, and they had to pretend until the border that they didn't know one another. I think I had this notion that as a girl, and I was a girl, you wouldn't think so now. Well, I graduated from Hopkins when I was 23, but I wanted to show the guys that I could do everything they did. I wanted probably to show the world that I could do everything.
So I showed him how to dump the rays in a bunch of times, and he just wasn't interested. So is that a fail, do you think? Or?
Well, if they can do it, they're usually interested. What about at home? Does the mom talk to him? Does she read to him? Does she?
So that's, I bring him books. I'll bring him another one, but I don't think so much.
The question is how much you want to push any one issue.
Yeah.
I feel for these people. Here's a woman who's not very strong ego and has all these problems in herself and them, so
Right.
pick your battles. I had been afraid of becoming a pediatrician because that was a stereotype thing. You have 2 X chromosomes, you take care of kids. And I didn't want to fall into that stereotype. But then I really decided I would like to work with children. So in my 3rd year of graduate training, I switched to pediatrics. Hello, how are you? I'm Dr. Korsch. We work in teams. We have a young, smart one and then an old, experienced one. Did you give him a toy?
No, I couldn't bring him one.
You flunked.
Yeah, I know.
Of all times, go get a toy right now. Let's have the toy.
All right.
Oh, I like his hat. You like his hat?
You know?
You want to play with him? What does he like to do the best?
He likes to play with his cars. Or the
Cars,
my cousin gave him those big cars.
So he just takes one bottle to go to sleep.
Yeah.
Well, you know, we all regress a little bit at bedtime.
Yeah.
Good. I'd love to see him again, see how he's progressing.
All right.
Okay?
That sounds great.
Bye. Nice to talk to you.
All right.
Thanks for helping us
You're
out.
welcome.
Bye. Nice to see you. Yes.
I first met Barbara when I was managing a toddler unit, not this unit, but 4 East, the unit below here, was a toddler unit. Dr. Korsch was our physician liaison, appointed to be our physician liaison. And I remember at the time, like, I thought, well, I think she's working in nephrology. I don't really know what she has to do with us or what. But the minute she showed up at our office door, she just plopped herself down and started chatting away. And I know for sure when she started talking about communication, everybody thought, you know, she went from nut to guru because she never changed her message. It wasn't a popular notion, and people didn't think that doctors had to listen to their patients, or that doctors should listen to nurses, or that people should listen to patients' families and parents. One of the things that Barbara has really brought to the forefront is that patients will be satisfied even if they don't get the best outcome if they feel heard. I think, you know, almost anybody could learn the anatomy and physiology, could learn the techniques, but not everybody can be a physician, a real physician, that really holistic. I mean, it's just really looking at their whole, it's a holistic view that she takes. She doesn't just look at what's wrong, you know, what's the clinical diagnosis, but she looks at the family dynamics and really listens to people. She just listens to people.
Very often when I've made these reforms, it's been against a lot of opposition. Because doctors, like everybody else, like what they're doing, the way they're doing, they think it's great. And when somebody wants to change it, they tend to resist. And you know, doctors are very prestigious. Everybody looks up to them. For them, it's even harder to change and say, maybe there's a better way. I found a group of very, very like-minded, progressive educators who were already there and very, very ready for my ideas and had some similar ones of their own.
Korsch found a kindred spirit in Dr. Lauren Stevens, an unusually sensitive orthopedic surgeon who was on the teaching staff at USC's School of Medicine. While Korsch's early studies demonstrated how to avoid miscommunications, Stevens' insights went to a deeper level. He believed that dehumanizing medical students and doctors in training made it impossible for them to open up their minds and empathize with patients. His message was that in order to understand their patients, it was essential for physicians to understand themselves and their feelings, to use their humanity instead of suppressing it. In the following footage, Stevens describes his discovery of his emotional connection with a patient.
And I was preparing for it, and I was to do it the next day, and I was curious. I had not seen his wife, and she called me up, and she said, I want you to take good care of him, and I want you to be careful in your operation. She said, I can't come because I'm blind. And this was another one of my rare sleepless nights. Got up the next morning, went and did the operation, very troubled and a little clumsy. And I think I've cut myself twice in the 20-some-odd years I've been doing operation. I cut myself that day, and I kept thinking, what's the matter with me and what's going on? I didn't get out of the operating room before it came to me, after we had finished the stitches. My mother's blind. My own mother is blind. My mother's attitude is a great deal towards my father, what this woman's attitude towards was, and it just came swarming into me. What I was troubled about was my father.
Lauren was such an idealistic, charismatic, wonderful inspiration to everybody that really he kind of, rode on a white charger, and we all followed him with enthusiasm.
I think I was in the right place at the right time. I had just done a film in the physical therapy environment, which was in similar theme with doctor-patient communication ideas that Barbara Korsch was interested in and Lauren Stevens was working on. So it was an excellent opportunity for a young film student to finally connect with people that had a lot of things to say, and I was learning the medium in order to help them say that. We started videotaping interviews with the medical students talking to the patients. And then we would play back those interviews with a small group of the medical students and their professors.
And we exposed them to just normal ranges of patients who often have strong feelings. And then they would discuss how they felt when they interviewed them and how they dealt with it, because we wanted them to become aware of their feelings as they're aroused by their patient's problems and as they then relate to how they manage the patient.
You get called out at odd hours to for a parent.
That's what grabs me when a doctor comes in belly aching because you called him out in the middle of the night. He knew that was part of the job when he took it. I did too. I never bragged when a truck driver called me in the middle of the night.
Seeing this part of the interview, I would be quite ill at ease, wondering about probably my own confidence to deal with this guy, and would I botch it up again, he said he's got how many suits going already.
For a fine-haired boy, till you have an injury, then right away you're a second-class citizen. I've heard a lot of nurses grumble about these compensation cases. Well, I can't see whether it's any different whether it's a compensation case or a private patient or even a charity case. The guy's entitled to a certain amount of dignity.
Well, he's angry. Yeah. Okay. Like his vena cava was injured during surgery. I wonder to what extent this man's attitude contributed to that damage.
And you wonder exactly that point. How many other doctors along the way had been provoked, and instead of recognizing that they were being provoked, might have gone ahead and done things that they might not have otherwise done.
Our big allies at that time were the students. This was the 60s, the days of the hippies. The students all had long hair and were rebellious, and they didn't think the traditional education was very good and that the traditional way of practicing medicine was very good.
I really hated medical school. I regarded it as really a waste, and I didn't learn anything. And I liked to learn things too, there was no joy of learning in medical school at all, period, anywhere.
Some of the structure of the training in many ways, in a traditional sense, was extremely difficult, and we've seen that shown in the media and literature for a long time, that it's a very stressful time for physicians emotionally as well as physically.
We started group discussions among the interns about themselves and their feelings and what they were learning from their faculty and who was helping them and who wasn't.
And it gets to the point where it's 4 o'clock in the morning and it's your 100th admitting night, and you just, at least me, I just, I go in the elevator and I cry for about 15 minutes. And why am I doing this? It's so awful.
But then there's evidence that as humane as they start medical school, by the time they graduate, they're already a little less so.
That's the one place where I don't have sympathy or empathy anymore. When I go into the ER and it's...
You like those people down there?
I dislike them intensely. There are some patients that I like. But if I go into a room and we have a fat baby on the bed and no Coronata is mentioned, I am livid because I think it's an abuse.
Before you even start?
Just before I start. And if it's a busy day, I'm just so mad, and I go around mad all day down there. If it's a Saturday and we're swamped and we're backed up 4 hours, 90% of the patients are going to make me so mad.
In fact, their faculty has often criticized them if they were too humane, get upset about a patient who was sick. You're supposed to be objective, scientific, not have too much feeling.
And it was frightening to me because, I would get upset, for example, if in trying to take blood out of somebody's wrist, radial blood, if I would feel the needle go deep enough that it hit the bone and someone would scream. It would get me upset, And he would, he would kind of scoff at me about that. What was encouraged was a kind of a pseudo-bravery that can only be fostered from a self-imposed callousness.
Physicians have responses to patients as people, whether they're aware of them or not, and it's much better to be aware of those responses in order to maintain proper medical care.
I think this is what has happened in medical education in the past. They say, well, do not become involved. Don't let your emotions involve you with this patient, because that will make you non-objective. I think this is wrong, because we do become involved emotionally with people, but we immediately sit on it, which doesn't mean that those feelings don't exist. I think to be aloof from a patient and not be emotionally involved with a patient is impossible. I just don't see how it's possible.
The medical community is a very tough community, and to make any changes, you have to have science. So that's when we started our big study, which was 1,000 patients, and had statistics that even were defensible to the most cynical scientific critics, of which there were many. They all thought we relate fine to our patients. What is this lady doctor doing, sentimental lady doctor who's trying to tell us we should relate differently to our patients? So I had to have evidence. So I gathered evidence.
It was a very interesting study, because what we were doing, some of the things that we were documenting people thought they were very obvious things, and why would anyone want to document that? But Dr. Korsch's feeling was that it didn't matter if it was obvious. If we could show numbers and show differences that occurred when certain things happened or didn't happen, then that it had some foundation and some backing. It wasn't just our opinion about what might work and what might not work.
We started this large, expensive, labor-intensive research. We didn't have any idea. First of all, we were going to learn something about communication that made a difference. I thought we would, but I didn't know. Or were these other things going to be the strongest predictors? That's why we had to do such a huge number, but we did. And in those days, they weren't as fussy about informed consent and all that, so we could actually do a randomized study, which we would never get away with now. It was very unethical. But it allowed us to study every single person who came through that clinic, and that's what we did. Oh, this is a wonderful case right here, where a young white doctor is talking to a dignified old black man and really patronizing him. She asks him to make 3 promises, 3 completely unrealistic promises, none of which is something he's capable of doing. So instead of finding out whom she's talking to, she's just impersonal, and of course it doesn't work.
Are you eating 3 meals a day?
Sometimes.
Why aren't you eating 3 meals a day all the time? Have you always not had a good appetite? You've never had a good appetite. Tell you what, would you make me a promise? 2 promises. One is that you'll stop smoking.
No.
You won't promise that. Will you think about it?
I'll do the best I can.
Okay.
But I won't promise.
And the other thing is that when you'll start eating 3 meals a day.
And in our final analysis, it turned out that how it was said was very important, whether it was friendly or judgmental or punitive or critical. And to our amazement, even though this was the issue I was going after, it turned out that the doctor-patient communication was the strongest determinant of outcome in terms of patient satisfaction, follow-through on medical advice, and return appointments.
An opportunity came up that I think Dr. Korsch or one of the other instructors in the program, the ICM program at USC, was active in the local pediatric society. And we thought this would be a wonderful environment to present our ideas in the videotape, and it would be a good teaching experience, and that they would be, we assumed that they were pediatricians, that they would be open to those ideas, because we all felt that we had a gospel to spread, and it was kind of like a new word, and it was an exciting thing to get it out there in front of people and to get responses to it.
We came in there like a few revolutionaries, and I've never spoken to such a hostile audience, and I've gotten close a couple of times. But so we refer that particular tape, which we still have, as the Biltmore bomb.
We trucked all of our gear and the ancient kind of video projector down to the Biltmore Hotel where they were having their meeting. And after dinner, we put on our show.
There were interviews with doctors and especially with medical students about the anguish they went through in learning how when they took care of patients with certain diseases, they thought they were carrying them themselves, how dying patients frightened them, how they over-identified with certain patients, how they were scared by the responsibilities that they had, and all the anguish that goes, if you're an honest person with insight, in becoming a physician and then functioning as a physician.
The real title was The Professionalization of the Medical Student.
Yeah, that's right. We dealt with ways people deal with the issues that arise in medical education.
One service, I kind of mismanaged a patient marginally. He was a 450-pound gentleman who was in for strain on his cardiac and respiratory system caused by his overweight, and I didn't treat him extremely vigorously, and I didn't write that he should be kept sitting up, and he'd been overweight like this for 20 years, but that was the night I knew he couldn't, that he turned blue and he lied on his back, and that was the night he decided to sleep on his back, and he expired. And I felt pretty bad about it for a while, and part of it was that this guy died, but as much of it, I think, was that it pointed out my incompetence.
When we finished showing it and we're asking for their responses, they said, "Oh, you know, why are we seeing these students kind of wallowing in their own self-pity and their struggles? I mean, this doesn't have anything. They're probably not going to make good doctors, and why are we even looking at that?" They didn't get the idea that we're very reactionary about it, and we're very surprised.
And the reception was ice cold. Nobody clapped or appreciated anything. And the atmosphere in the room got so bad, you know, we wished we could have turned off the tape. They said, you know, we went through all that and we turned out fine. And why do they have to be such softies and such weaklings? Look at us, we turned out great. And of course, our message, which was not very welcome, was no, we didn't turn out so great. Patient care actually suffers from this dehumanization.
My whole feeling about being taught and being encouraged to have inadequate and maladaptive defenses is really important. That I see people around me who have not dealt with these matters, and that's really shitty for a patient. Like, I mean, for say a person who's dying, like they have a doctor who's been in practice for 40 years or something, who's never really dealt with his feelings about death. You know, to the point where he's just so frightened of it that he just retreats, and I don't blame him.
I was able to publish my findings early on in a Scientific American, which is read by a lay audience, and we got a correspondence which the Scientific American said was one of the largest public responses to any of their articles. The patient community responded very positively. This was at a time when the patients were already beginning to be more critical, more vocal about their dissatisfaction with doctors.
He said, "Do you think you ought to be hospitalized, huh?" I said, "I don't see any other alternative." He said, "Okay, I'll hospitalize you." It took them 5 days to get me a room in the hospital, and I was hospitalized. And from there on in, just almost neglected.
My doctor doesn't understand me, my doctor doesn't listen to me. My doctor doesn't know me as a person, he's very inhuman, very insensitive. We were hearing that all of the time.
Sometimes I think they sell us short and don't tell us enough about what to expect or everything that's happening. Like, it took me through all kinds of questions of the doctor to get him to tell me really what the full scope of my surgery was, everything that they did and why they did it. But I had to drag it out of him. It wasn't easy to come by.
Once you get these doctors and they come in, you know, and you get nothing out of them, you ask them a question and they look at you, and then they wander off into the office and they come back and say no, period. And yet, where are you?
Although she was a doctor, she was seen as being anti-doctor in some ways, because she was finding fault with the way that doctors did certain things, and therefore that was seen as, you know, a doctor hater.
I was fighting in the tradition of my ancestors against opposition, against scathing, cynical responses, and that's when I really needed my conviction that what I was doing was better for patients and also for doctors, because I did fight against the mainstream for many years.
I think it starts from before she ever became a physician. I think it has to do with how she was raised. I think it has to do with who her parents were. Her father was a very active, opinionated person who took often the path of greater resistance.
England doesn't like a scandal, you know, and my father was an immigrant. And they also knew his politics. But here enters another interesting sideline on my father. All his life he liked the ladies and they liked him. He was very handsome and he was not strictly monogamous. He was very faithful to my mother and the family, but he was always involved with other ladies, or if not, they were involved with him. And while he was staying in England waiting for us, there were two ladies who I think also were political sympathizers of his and knew his work, who allegedly both fell in love with him and left big notes that they did it for him. And of course their death was a big scandal in London. 2 women found dead, and then there's notes. So he was deported from England, so we couldn't go to England. So we had to look elsewhere, so we decided America. Everybody speaks English. Very wisely, I was sent to a boarding school because my mother felt I should learn about American customs, and I was sent to a very fancy finishing school, which was not notorious for its wonderful education, but which really finished girls, you know, so that we learned how to behave, how to dress, our manners, how to eat. We dressed for dinner every night, long dresses. They gave us little checking accounts, because these were all rich girls who were supposed to learn how to handle their money. We didn't have any money, so my parents just put a little something in a bank so I could have a bank account. And after that, it was a big relief to go to Smith, where I had a wonderful time. And, you know, then from Smith, I went to Hopkins. So I was just 20 when I entered med school. And then it was during the Second World War, and we were on something called the accelerated program. They really needed doctors. And so we went 3 years instead of 4, which meant that they crammed even more things into 3 years. So I graduated when I was 23. I was a doctor when I was 23.
Well, Dr. Korsch is a real proponent of filming yourself. So, you know, and it was one of the things that we tried to avoid, was being videotaped, and then not only being videotaped, but then having to sit through and watch yourself interact with the family. Because we all came out of each encounter believing we had done a wonderful job, we had answered all of their questions, allayed all of their fears, and, you know, we're quite pleased with ourselves.
Welcome to this quiet little feedback session. You've worked hard preparing for it, now you're working hard during.
One thing I want to improve on is I'm shuffling papers all the time. I'm constantly looking for papers.
Some physicians use the chart as a barrier between themselves and the patient, and some of them use it in a kind of a joint way, and that's what you did there.
Okay.
All right, kiddo.
You spend a lot of time on auscultation. Is that because she mentioned that sometimes the breathing was faster? Or?
Yeah, she was concerned. She was very concerned about his breathing.
What were you listening for, if I may ask?
You know, I don't exactly remember, but I know a lot of times with babies that their heart rates are pretty fast. So I just want to make sure that they don't have any murmurs. So I don't know if that was it.
But you'd seen her in the hospital. It's unlikely she would have developed a
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, at one point they all left the room.
Right. without warning?
All the kids ran out, and then the parents went to go find him.
It's strange to see yourself on tape, actually. You don't sound like you would expect. You don't even look like you would necessarily expect. You see a lot of things, your body language that you might not ever have been aware that you carry yourself in that way. And it's a very enlightening experience.
Then through the 60s and 70s, my work became accepted. And in the beginning, the rest of the faculty were not very open to it. But gradually, and certainly at the medical school, the students helped us a lot. We felt this is something doctors don't just naturally do because they're good biologists or good people, but that communicating with patients is one of the processes in giving medical care, and that, like everything else, you have to learn it.
Dr. Korsch has a couple in her arsenal of notoriously horrible communication where the doctor is making no eye contact and throwing out all kinds of medical terms that are terrifying to the parent and not explaining it. And she always gets a laugh, which is so funny, because when we used to speak to physicians and she'd play the video, you'd hear this just outrageous laughter in the audience because nobody could believe that it was real. And when they heard that it was a real transcription or a real incident, everybody would just sort of shake their head and say, oh, I couldn't possibly communicate that poorly. And those were the people that unfortunately sometimes we'd videotape, and they did. It may not have been as obvious, but it was as shocking.
Many people ask me, you know, you've been teaching this for 50 years. Has communication gotten better? I'm not egocentric enough to think I personally have made a lot of difference, but I certainly was the one who called attention to it as a problem and was the first to attempt to deal with the problem.
I think patients I can't help bother me the most, and always have in different ways. And I can think of specifics and maybe ways that I've changed my attitudes. And I think my biggest switch there was when those problems began to interest me in themselves as a scientific area for inquiry.
Most people give me credit for being the pioneer in this field. Since then, it's burgeoned, and it's very gratifying to me when I have a bunch of new interns now, and we start one of our teaching sessions. I'll ask them, in your medical school, did you have any course in doctor-patient communication? Have you ever been videotaped, which is the methodology? And many of them will have had some training before they even graduate. That's radically different from when we started.
¿Conoce la doctora Korsch?
Soy doctora Korsch. Buenas tardes, ¿cómo le va? Buenas tardes. Buenas tardes, ¿cómo estás?
Las amigas de ella. Third digit. Show off the goods.
It must have hurt when you did it, huh? Not too much.
No.
You're brave.
Yeah.
Communication is the hallmark of being a doctor. I mean, you can amass an enormous amount of medical, technical knowledge and be a very, very proficient clinician and speak the jargon. If you fail to communicate to caregivers, to parents, so that they understand what is going on with their children, then I think you've truly failed in your role, no matter how bright you may be. We always talk about, gosh, in hindsight, boy, you're just a little bit before your time. What a lot of people don't do is persevere, because there were so many naysayers at the time. In contradistinction to those people, she persevered. And now, in her lifetime, which is a wonderful thing to realize, to see the acceptance of that now in the twilight of her career. I'm pleased that she has the opportunity now to see the medical community embrace the concepts that she was a champion for long before they were popular.
The image I've tried to develop is that I'm a biomedically excellent physician, uses good judgment, has good skills in diagnosis and treatment, but who has incorporated in that the humanity of being just a human being, and especially of being a woman. And so I think of myself as a sensitive, very experienced woman physician. And I think besides the woman and sensitive, the experienced has made a lot of difference because I'm not as dogmatic as I used to be. I used to think I knew a lot of things. And after 60 years in practice, I'm much more modest about that. Well, what I know in medicine and what I know in life. It's been very disappointing to me to observe both live and on tape how rarely residents go into an exam room with a toy in hand, take a moment to figure out what toy would be appropriate for the child's age, and then arm themselves. They're not sure, ask one of us, and take them in. The point of those toys is that in order to interact with children of all ages, certainly you come across more as a friend than a foe if you start by introducing them to a toy. This is my husband and I years ago when we were happily married out here in California. Here's another picture of him. He was also spectacularly handsome. I always thought this looked like the beginning of South Pacific, you know, some enchanted evening. You expect him to open his mouth. And this is my sister, with whom I lived here quite a while. When we first, after I was a widow, we moved together here. She is, I think, peeling apples. I like applesauce. And for better or for worse, my son became a surfer. There he is on his surfboard. There he is when he was in, we used to go to Maine every summer, and there he is on the beach. I love it because it gives the whole image of the beach in Maine and all that. This is one of my most famous ancestors. Her name is Hedwig Doom. They've just had, it's her 175th anniversary. She was one of 12 children at a time when women weren't supposed to be educated. Her family sent all the boys to school, but she was supposed to be home and learn to cook and embroider. She rebelled and she was an autodidact. She educated herself, and she started writing books. And she was a great freedom fighter. She was also one of the first feminists and is recognized for that. And this book, for instance, is called The Anti Feminists, because she doesn't really fight for women alone. She fights for freedom and rights.